The Battle of Britain is the name given to the Second World War air campaign waged by the German Air Force against the United Kingdom during the summer and autumn of 1940. The name is derived from a famous speech delivered by Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the House of Commons. The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. The Battle of Britain was the first major campaign to be fought entirely by air forces, and was also the largest and most sustained aerial bombing campaign to that date. The German objective was to gain air superiority over the Royal Air Force, especially Fighter Command. From July 1940, coastal shipping convoys and shipping centers, such as Portsmouth, were the main targets. 1 month later, the Luftwaffe shifted its attacks to RAF airfields and infrastructure. As the battle progressed, the Luftwaffe also targeted aircraft factories and ground infrastructure. Eventually the Luftwaffe resorted to attacking areas of political significance and using terror bombing strategy. By preventing Germany from gaining air superiority, the battle ended the threat that Hitler would launch Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious and airborne invasion of Britain. However, Germany continued bombing operations on Britain, known as the Blitz. The failure of Germany to achieve its objectives of destroying Britain's air defences, or forcing Britain to negotiate an armistice or an outright surrender, is considered its first major defeat and a crucial turning point in the Second World War. Background: the early stages of the Second World War saw successful German invasions on the continent supported by Luftwaffe air power able to establish tactical air superiority. In early May 1940, the Norway debate questioned the fitness for office of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. On May 10, the same day Winston Churchill became British Prime Minister, the Germans invaded France. RAF Fighter Command was desperately short of trained pilots and aircraft, but despite the objections of its commander Hugh Dowding that this left home defences under strength, Churchill sent fighter squadrons to support operations in France, where the RAF suffered heavy losses. After the evacuation of British and French soldiers from Dunkirk and the French surrender on June 22, 1940, Hitler was mainly focused on the possibilities of invading the Soviet Union while believing that the British, defeated on the continent and without European allies, would quickly come to terms. Germans were so convinced of an imminent armistice that they began constructing street decorations for homecoming parades of victorious troops. Although the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, and an element of British public and political sentiment favoured a negotiated peace with an ascendant Germany, Churchill and a majority of his cabinet refused to consider an armistice with Hitler. Instead, Churchill used his skillful rhetoric to harden public opinion against capitulation, and to prepare the British for a long war. In his "This Was Their Finest Hour" speech on June 18, 1940, he said the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. After a series of victories, Germany ruled most of Central Europe. From Poland to France, Denmark and Norway. Hitler hoped for a negotiated peace with Britain, but had made no preparations for amphibious assault on a hostile shore. At the time, the only forces with modern equipment and experience were the Japanese at the Battle of Wuhan. On July 11, Grand Admiral Erich Roeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, told Hitler that an invasion could only be contemplated as a last resort, and only after full air superiority had been achieved. The Kriegsmarine had been nearly crippled by the Norwegian campaign, with many of its ships having been sunk or damaged, while the Royal Navy still had over 50 destroyers, 21 cruisers and 8 battleships in the British Home Fleet. There was little the weakened Kriegsmarine could do to stop the Royal Navy from intervening. The only alternative was to use the Luftwaffe's dive bombers and torpedo bombers, which required air superiority to operate effectively. Grand Admiral Roeder said, "A powerful and effective air force might create conditions favorable for an invasion, whether it could was not in the Navy War Staff's province." On July 16, although he agreed with Roeder, Hitler ordered the preparation of a plan to invade Britain. He also hoped that news of the preparations would frighten Britain into peace negotiations. Directive No. 16. On the preparation of a landing operation against England read, in part, as follows. Since England, despite its militarily hopeless situation, still has not shown any signs of being prepared to negotiate. I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England and, if necessary, carry it out. The objective of this operation is to eliminate the English home country as a base for the continuation of the war against Germania. 2. Included in these preparations is the bringing about of those preconditions which make a landing in England possible. A. The English Air Force must have been beaten down to such an extent morally and in fact that it can no longer muster any power of attack worth mentioning against the German crossing. All preparations were to be made by mid-August. For secrecy, this directive was only issued to commanders-in-chief, but Hermann Gar Paragraph Ring passed it on to his Luftwaffe air fleet commanders by coded radio messages, which were intercepted by Britain's Y service and successfully decrypted by Hut 6 at Bletchley Park. The Kriegsmarine produced a draft plan for achieving a narrow beachhead near Dover. On July 28 the army responded that they wanted landings all along the south coast of England. Hitler held a meeting of his army and navy chiefs on July 31 in his Berghof, and on August 1 the OKW issued its plan. The plan, codenamed Unternehmen Ziele Paragraph W, was scheduled to take place in mid-September 1940. Ziele Paragraph W called for landings on the south coast of Great Britain, backed by an airborne assault. Neither Hitler nor OKW believed it would be possible to carry out a successful amphibious assault on Britain until the RAF had been neutralized. Roeder believed that air superiority might make a successful landing possible, although it would be a risky operation and required absolute mastery over the channel by our air forces. Conversely, Grand Admiral Karl Dar Paragraph Nitz believed air superiority was not enough. Dar Paragraph Nitz later stated, "We possess neither control of the air or the sea. Nor were we in any position to gain it." Some writers, such as Derek Robinson, have agreed with Dar Paragraph Nitz. Robinson argues that the massive superiority of the Royal Navy over the Kriegsmarine would have made Sea Lion a disaster and the Luftwaffe could not have prevented decisive intervention by British cruisers and destroyers, even with their superiority. Williamson Murray argued that the task facing the Germans in summer 1940 was beyond their capabilities. The three German armed services were not capable of solving the problem of invading the British Isles. Murray contends that the Kriegsmarine had been effectively eliminated owing to heavy losses during the Norwegian campaign. Murray states it is doubtful that the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe could have prevented the Royal Navy from engaging the invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe had not been represented at the Berghof, but Gar Paragraph Ring was confident that air victory was possible. Like many commanders in other air forces, including the RAF, he was convinced by the ideas of Julio Douhet that the bomber will always get through, and if attacks on military targets failed, bombing civilians could force the British government to surrender. Opposing forces. The Luftwaffe faced a more capable opponent than any it had previously met, a sizable, highly coordinated, well-supplied, modern air force. Fighters. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109E and Bf-110C fought against the RAF's workhorse Hurricane Mki and the less numerous Spitfire Mki. The Bf-109E had a better climb rate and was 10 mph faster than the Hurricane Mki, depending on altitude. In spring and summer 1940, RAF fighters benefited from increased availability of 100-octane aviation fuel, which allowed their Merlin engines to generate significantly more power through the use of an emergency boost override. In September 1940, the more powerful Mko Series 1 Hurricanes started entering service in small numbers. This version was capable of a maximum speed of 342 mph, some 25 30 mph more than the Mki. The performance of the Spitfire over Dunkirk came as a surprise to the Jaguar, although the German pilots retained a strong belief that the 109 was the superior fighter. The British fighters were equipped with 8 Browning .303 machine guns, while most Bf-109s had two 7.92mm machine guns supplemented by two 20mm cannons. The latter was much more effective than the .303. Many German planes landed despite large numbers of .303 hits. At some altitudes, the Bf-109 could outclimb the British fighter. It could also engage in vertical plane negative G maneuvers without the engine cutting out because its DB601 engine used fuel injection. This allowed the 109 to dive away from attackers more readily than the carburetor-equipped Merlin. On the other hand, the Bf-109E had a much larger turning circle than its two foes. In general, though, as Alfred Price noted in the Spitfire story, the differences between the Spitfire and the Me-109 in performance and handling were only marginal, and in a combat they were almost always surmounted by tactical considerations: which side had seen the other first, had the advantage of sun, altitude, numbers, pilot ability, tactical situation, tactical coordination, amount of fuel remaining, etc. The Bf-109E was also used as a Jerboa. The E-4 per byte and E-7 models could carry a 250 kg bomb underneath the fuselage, the later model arriving during the battle. The Bf-109, unlike the Stuka, could fight on equal terms with RAF fighters after releasing its ordnance. At the start of the battle, the twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf-110C long-range Zester paragraph Air was also expected to engage in air-to-air combat while escorting the Luftwaffe bomber fleet. Although the 110 was faster than the Hurricane and almost as fast as the Spitfire, its lack of maneuverability and acceleration meant that it was a failure as a long-range escort fighter. On 13 and 15 August, 13 and 30 aircraft were lost, the equivalent of an entire group, and the type's worst losses during the campaign. This trend continued with a further 8 and 15 lost on 16 and 17 August. GAR paragraph Ring ordered the Bf-110 units to operate, where the range of the single-engined machines were not sufficient. The most successful role of the Bf-110 during the battle was as a Schnell bomber. The Bf-110 usually used a shallow dive to bomb the target and escape at high speed. One unit, Iprabunksgrupp 210 Euro, initially formed as the service test unit for the emerging successor to the 110, the Me-210 Euro proved that the Bf-110 could still be used to good effect in attacking small or pinpoint targets. The RAF's Bolton Paul Defiant had some initial success over Dunkirk because of its resemblance to the Hurricane. Luftwaffe fighters attacking from the rear were surprised by its unusual gun turret. However, during the Battle of Britain, this single-engine two-seater proved hopelessly outclassed. For various reasons, the Defiant lacked any form of forward-firing armament, and the heavy turret and second crewman meant it could not outrun or outmaneuver either the Bf-109 or Bf-110. By the end of August, after disastrous losses, the aircraft was withdrawn from daylight service. Bombers. The Luftwaffe's four primary bombers were the Heinkel He-111, Dornier Do-17, and Junkers Ju-88 for level bombing, and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka for diving attacks. The Heinkel He-111 was used in greater numbers than the others during the conflict and is better known, partly due to its distinctive wing shape. Each level bomber also had a few reconnaissance versions that were used during the battle. Although successful in previous Luftwaffe engagements, the Stuka suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Britain, particularly on August 18, due to its slow speed and vulnerability to fighter interception after the dive bombing. As a result of the losses and limited payload and range, Stuka units were largely removed from operations over England and concentrated on shipping instead until they were redeployed to the Eastern Front in 1941. They returned on occasion, such as on September 13 to attack Tankmere Airfield. The remaining three bomber types differed in their capabilities. The Heinkel 111 was the slowest. The Ju-88 was the fastest once its mainly external bomb load was dropped. And the Do-17 had the smallest bomb load. All three bomber types suffered heavy losses from British fighters, but the Ju-88 disproportionately so. The German bombers required constant protection by the Luftwaffe's fighter force. There were not enough Bf-109s to support more than 300 Euro 400 bombers on any given day. Later in the conflict, when night bombing became more frequent, all three were used. However, due to its reduced bomb load, the lighter Do-17 was used less than the He-111 and Ju-88 for this purpose. On the British side, 3 bomber types were mostly used on night operations against targets such as factories, invasion ports and railway centres. The Armstrong-Whitworth-Whitley, the Handley-Page-Hampden and the Vickers-Wellington were classified as heavy bombers by the RAF, although the Hampden was a medium bomber comparable to the He-111. The twin-engine Bristol Blenheim and the obsolescent single-engined Fanny Ray Battle were both light bombers. The Blenheim was the most numerous of the aircraft equipping RAF Bomber Command and was used in attacks against shipping, ports, airfields and factories on the continent by day and by night. The Fanny Ray Battle squadrons, which had suffered heavy losses in daylight attacks during the Battle of France, were brought up to strength with reserve aircraft and continued to operate at night in attacks against the invasion ports, until the battle was withdrawn from UK frontline service in October 1940. Pilots. Before the war, the RAF's processes for selecting potential candidates were opened to men of all social classes through the creation of the RAF Volunteer Reserve in 1936 which was designed to appeal to young men without any class distinction. The older squadrons of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force did retain some of their upper-class exclusiveness, but their number was soon swamped by the newcomers of the RAF VR, and by September 1, 1939, 6646 pilots had been trained through the RAF VR. By summer 1940, there were about 9,000 pilots in the RAF for approximately 5,000 aircraft, most of which were bombers. Fighter Command was never short of pilots, but the problem of finding sufficient numbers of fully trained fighter pilots became acute by mid-August 1940. With aircraft production running at 300 each week, only 200 pilots were trained in the same period. In addition, more pilots were allocated to squadrons than there were aircraft, as this allowed squadrons to maintain operational strength despite casualties and still provide for pilot leave. Another factor was that only about 30% of the 9,000 pilots were assigned to operational squadrons. 20% of the pilots were involved in conducting pilot training, and a further 20% were undergoing further instruction, like those offered in Canada and in Southern Rhodesia to the Commonwealth trainees, although already qualified. The rest were assigned to staff positions, since RAF policy dictated that only pilots could make many staff and operational command decisions, even in engineering matters. At the height of fighting, and despite Churchill's insistence, only 30 pilots were released to the front line from administrative duties. For these reasons, and the permanent loss of 435 pilots during Battle of France alone with many more wounded, and others lost in Norway, the RAF had fewer experienced pilots at the start of the battle, and it was the lack of trained pilots in the fighting squadrons, rather than the lack of aircraft, that became the greatest concern for Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command. Drawing from regular RAF forces and the Auxiliary Air Force and the Volunteer Reserve, the British could muster some 1,103 fighter pilots on July 1. Replacement pilots, with little flight training and often no gunnery training, suffered high casualty rates. The Luftwaffe could muster a larger number of more experienced fighter pilots. Drawing from a cadre of Spanish Civil War veterans, they had comprehensive courses in aerial gunnery and instructions in tactics suited for fighter versus fighter combat. Training manuals also discouraged heroism, stressing the utmost importance of attacking only when the odds were in the pilot's favor. However, German fighter formations did not provide a sufficient reserve of pilots to allow for losses and leave, and the Luftwaffe was unable to produce enough pilots to prevent a decline in operational strength as the battle progressed. International participation, Allies. The Royal Air Force Roll of Honour for the Battle of Britain recognises 595 non-British pilots as flying at least one authorised operational sortie with an eligible unit of the RAF or Fleet Air Arm between July 10 and October 31, 1940. These included 145 Poles, 127 New Zealanders, 112 Canadians, 88 Czechoslovaks, 10 Irish, 32 Australians, 28 Belgians, 25 South Africans, 13 French, 7 Americans, 3 Southern Rhodesians and 1 each from Jamaica and Mandatory Palestine. Altogether in the fighter battles, the bombing raids, and the various patrols flown between July 10 and October 31, 1940 by the Royal Air Force, 1495 aircrew were killed, of whom 449 were fighter pilots, 718 aircrew from Bomber Command, and 280 from Coastal Command. Among those killed were 47 airmen from Canada, 24 from Australia, 17 from South Africa, 35 from Poland, 20 from Czechoslovakia and 6 from Belgium. 47 New Zealanders lost their lives, including 15 fighter pilots, 24 bomber and 8 coastal aircrew. The names of these Allied and Commonwealth airmen are inscribed in a memorial book which rests in the Battle of Britain Chapel in Westminster Abbey. In the chapel is a stained glass window which contains the badges of the fighter squadrons which operated during the battle and the flags of the nations to which the pilots and aircrew belonged. Axis. An element of the Italian Royal Air Force called the Italian Air Corps first saw action in late October 1940. It took part in the latter stages of the battle, but achieved limited success. The unit was redeployed in early 1941. Luftwaffe strategy. The Luftwaffe was devised to provide tactical support for the army on the battlefield. During the Blitzkrieg offensives against Poland, Denmark and Norway, France and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe had cooperated fully with the Wehrmacht. For the Battle of Britain, however, the Luftwaffe had to operate in a strategic role, something for which it was unsuited. Its main task was to ensure air supremacy over southeast England, to pave the way for an invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe regrouped after the Battle of France into 3 Luftflotten on Britain's southern and northern flanks. Luftflotte 2, commanded by General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, was responsible for the bombing of southeast England and the London area. Luftflotte 3, under General Field Marshal Hugo Spell, targeted the West Country, Wales, the Midlands, and northwest England. Luftflotte 5, led by General Oberst Hans Jar-1 Gen Stump from his headquarters in Norway, targeted the north of England and Scotland. As the battle progressed, command responsibility shifted, with Luftflotte 3 taking more responsibility for the nighttime blitz attacks while the main daylight operations fell upon Luftflotte 2's shoulders. Initial Luftwaffe estimates were that it would take 4 days to defeat the RAF Fighter Command in southern England. This would be followed by a 4-week offensive during which the bombers and long-range fighters would destroy all military installations throughout the country and wreck the British aircraft industry. The campaign was planned to begin with attacks on airfields near the coast, gradually moving inland to attack the ring of sector airfields defending London. Later reassessments gave the Luftwaffe 5 weeks, from August 8 to September 15, to establish temporary air superiority over England. To achieve this goal, Fighter Command had to be destroyed either on the ground or in the air, yet the Luftwaffe had to be able to preserve its own strength to be able to support the invasion. This meant that the Luftwaffe had to maintain a high kill ratio over the RAF fighters. The only alternative to the goal of air superiority was a terror bombing campaign aimed at the civilian population, but this was considered a last resort and it was expressly forbidden by Hitler. The Luftwaffe kept broadly to this scheme, but its commanders had differences of opinion on strategy. Spell wanted to eradicate the air defense infrastructure by bombing it. His counterpart, Kesselring, championed attacking London directly either to bombard the British government into submission or to draw RAF fighters into a decisive battle. Paragraph-ring did nothing to resolve this disagreement between his commanders, and only vague directives were set down during the initial stages of the battle, with Paragraph-ring seemingly unable to decide upon which strategy to pursue. He seemed at times obsessed with maintaining his own power base in the Luftwaffe and indulging his outdated beliefs on air fighting, which would later lead to tactical and strategic errors. Tactics, fighter formations. Luftwaffe formations employed a loose section of 2, based on a leader followed at a distance of about 183 meters by his wingman, who also flew slightly higher and was trained always to stay with his leader. With more room between them, both pilots could spend less time maintaining formation and more time looking around and covering each other's blind spots. Attacking aircraft could be sandwiched between the two 109s. The rot allowed the ROT and FAR 1/4 Air to concentrate on getting kills, but few wingmen had the chance, leading to some resentment in the lower ranks where it was felt that the high scores came at their expense. Two sections were usually teamed up into a schwarm, where all the pilots could watch what was happening around them. Each schwarm in a staff flew at staggered heights and with 183 meters of room between them, making the formation difficult to spot at longer ranges and allowing for a great deal of flexibility. By utilizing a tight crossover turn, a schwarm could quickly change direction. The Bf-110s adopted the same schwarm formation as the 109s, but were seldom able to use this to the same advantage. The Bf-110's most successful method of attack was the bounce from above. When attacked, Paragraph increasingly resorted to forming large defensive circles, where each Bf-110 guarded the tail of the aircraft ahead of it. Paragraph ordered that they be renamed defensive circles in a vain bid to improve rapidly declining morale. These conspicuous formations were often successful in attracting RAF fighters that were sometimes bounced by high-flying Bf-109s. This led to the often repeated myth that the Bf-110s were escorted by Bf-109s. Higher-level dispositions, Luftwaffe tactics were influenced by their fighters. The Bf-110 proved too vulnerable to the nimble single-engined RAF fighters. This meant the bulk of fighter escort duties fell on the Bf-109. Fighter tactics were then complicated by bomber crews who demanded closer protection. After the hard-fought battles of 15th and 18th August, Paragraph met with his unit leaders. During this conference, the need for the fighters to meet up on time with the bombers was stressed. It was also decided that one bomber group could only be properly protected by several grouping of 109s. In addition, Paragraph stipulated that as many fighters as possible were to be left free for free JAGD. The Ju-87 units, which had suffered heavy casualties, were only to be used under favorable circumstances. In early September, due to increasing complaints from the bomber crews about RAF fighters seemingly able to get through the escort screen, Paragraph ordered an increase in close escort duties. This decision shackled many of the Bf-109s to the bombers and, although they were more successful at protecting the bomber forces, casualties amongst the fighters mounted primarily because they were forced to fly and maneuver at reduced speeds. The Luftwaffe consistently varied its tactics in its attempts to break through the RAF defenses. It launched many free JAGD to draw up RAF fighters. RAF fighter controllers, however, were often able to detect these and position squadrons to avoid them, keeping to Dowding's plan to preserve fighter strength for the bomber formations. The Luftwaffe also tried using small formations of bombers as bait, covering them with large numbers of escorts. This was more successful, but escort duty tied the fighters to the bombers' slow speed and made them more vulnerable. By September, standard tactics for raids had become an amalgam of techniques. A free JAGD would precede the main attack formations. The bombers would fly in at altitudes between 16,000 feet and 20,000 feet, closely escorted by fighters. Escorts were divided into two parts, some operating in close contact with the bombers, and others a few hundred yards away and a little above. If the formation was attacked from the starboard section engaged the attackers, the top section moving to starboard and the port section to the top position. If the attack came from the port side, the system was reversed. British fighters coming from the rear were engaged by the rear section and the two outside sections similarly moving to the rear. If the threat came from above, the top section went into action while the side sections gained height to be able to follow RAF fighters down as they broke away. If attacked, all sections flew in defensive circles. These tactics were skillfully evolved and carried out, and were extremely difficult to counter. Adolf Galland noted, "We had the impression that, whatever we did, we were bound to be wrong." Fighter protection for bombers created many problems which had to be solved in action. Bomber pilots preferred close screening in which their formation was surrounded by pairs of fighters pursuing a zigzag course. Obviously, the visible presence of the protective fighters gave the bomber pilots a greater sense of security. However, This was a faulty conclusion, because a fighter can only carry out this purely defensive task by taking the initiative in the offensive. He must never wait until attacked because he then loses the chance of acting. We fighter pilots certainly preferred the free chase during the approach and over the target area. This gives the greatest relief and the best protection for the bomber force. The biggest disadvantage faced by Bf-109 pilots was that without the benefit of long-range drop tanks, usually of 300 liters capacity, the 109s had an endurance of just over an hour and, for the 109E, a 600 km range. Once over Britain, a 109 pilot had to keep an eye on a red low fuel light on the instrument panel. Once this was illuminated, he was forced to turn back and head for France. With the prospect of 2 long flights over water, and knowing their range was substantially reduced when escorting bombers or during combat, the JAG glider coined the term canal crankite or channel sickness. Intelligence. The Luftwaffe was ill-served by its lack of military intelligence about the British defences. The German intelligence services were fractured and plagued by rivalries. Their performance was amateurish. By 1940, there were few German agents operating in Great Britain and a handful of bungled attempts to insert spies into the country were foiled. As a result of intercepted radio transmissions, the Germans began to realize that the RAF fighters were being controlled from ground facilities. In July and August 1939, for example, the airship Graf Zeppelin, which was packed with equipment for listening in on RAF radio and RDF transmissions, flew around the coasts of Britain. Although the Luftwaffe correctly interpreted these new ground control procedures, they were incorrectly assessed as being rigid and ineffectual. A British radar system was well known to the Luftwaffe from intelligence gathered before the war, but the highly developed Dowding system linked with fighter control had been a well-kept secret. Even when good information existed, such as a November 1939 Abwehr assessment of fighter command strengths and capabilities by ATIA Lung V, it was ignored if it did not match conventional preconceptions. On July 16, 1940, ATIA Lung V, commanded by Oberstleutnant Beppo Schmidt, produced a report on the RAF and on Britain's defensive capabilities which was adopted by the frontline commanders as a basis for their operational plans. One of the most conspicuous failures of the report was the lack of information on the RAF's RDF network and control systems capabilities. It was assumed that the system was rigid and inflexible, with the RAF fighters being tied to their home bases. An optimistic and, as it turned out, erroneous conclusion reached was the supply situation. At present the British aircraft industry produces about 180 to 300 first-line fighters and 140 first-line bombers a month. In view of the present conditions relating to production, it is believed that for the time being output will decrease rather than increase. In the event of an intensification of air warfare, it is expected that the present strength of the RAF will fall, and this decline will be aggravated by the continued decrease in production. Because of this statement, reinforced by another more detailed report, issued on August 10, there was a mindset in the ranks of the Luftwaffe that the RAF would run out of frontline fighters. The Luftwaffe believed it was weakening fighter command at 3 times the actual attrition rate. Many times, the leadership believed fighter command strength had collapsed, only to discover that the RAF were able to send up defensive formations at will. Throughout the battle, the Luftwaffe had to use numerous reconnaissance sorties to make up for the poor intelligence. Reconnaissance aircraft proved easy prey for British fighters, as it was seldom possible for them to be escorted by Bf-109s. Thus, the Luftwaffe operated blind for much of the battle, unsure of its enemy's true strengths, capabilities, and deployments. Many of the fighter command airfields were never attacked, while raids against supposed fighter airfields fell instead on bomber or coastal defense stations. The results of bombing and air fighting were consistently exaggerated, due to inaccurate claims, over-enthusiastic reports and the difficulty of confirmation over enemy territory. In the euphoric atmosphere of perceived victory, the Luftwaffe leadership became increasingly disconnected from reality. This lack of leadership and solid intelligence meant the Germans did not adopt consistent strategy, even when the RAF had its back to the wall. Moreover, there was never a systematic focus on one type of target. Consequently, the already haphazard effort was further diluted. Navigational aids. While the British were using radar for air defence more effectively than the Germans realised, the Luftwaffe attempted to press its own offensive with advanced radio navigation systems of which the British were initially not aware. One of these was Knickebein. This system was used at night and for raids where precision was required. It was rarely used during the Battle of Britain. Air-sea rescue. The Luftwaffe was much better prepared for the task of air-sea rescue than the RAF, specifically tasking the Seenotdienst unit, equipped with about 30 Heinkel He-59 Float planes, with picking up downed aircrew from the North Sea, English Channel and the Dover Straits. In addition, Luftwaffe aircraft were equipped with life rafts and the aircrew were provided with sachets of a chemical called fluorescein which, on reacting with water, created a large, easy-to-see, bright green patch. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, the He-59s were unarmed and painted white with civilian registration markings and red crosses. Nevertheless, RAF aircraft attacked these aircraft, as some were escorted by Bf-109s. After single He-59s were forced to land on the sea by RAF fighters, on 1st and 9th July respectively, a controversial order was issued to the RAF on July 13. This stated that from July 20, Seenotdienst aircraft were to be shot down. One of the reasons given by Churchill was, "We did not recognize this means of rescuing enemy pilots so they could come and bomb our civil population in Ghana." All German air ambulances were forced down or shot down by our fighters on definite orders approved by the War Cabinet. The British also believed that their crews would report on convoys, the Air Ministry issuing a communiqué copyright to the German government on July 14 that Britain was unable, however, to grant immunity to such aircraft flying over areas in which operations are in progress on land or at sea, or approaching British or Allied territory, or territory in British occupation, or British or Allied ships. Ambulance aircraft which do not comply with the above will do so at their own risk and peril. The white He-59s were soon repainted in camouflage colors and armed with defensive machine guns. Although another 4 He-59s were shot down by RAF aircraft, the Seenotdienst continued to pick up downed Luftwaffe and Allied aircrew throughout the battle, earning praise from Adolf Galland for their bravery. RAF strategy, the Dowding system. During early tests of the Chain-Holmes system, the slow flow of information from the CH radars and observers to the aircraft often caused them to miss their bandits. The solution, today known as the Dowding system, was to create a set of reporting chains to move information from the various observation points to the pilots in their fighters. It was named after its chief architect, Stuffy Dowding. Reports from CH radars and the observer call were sent directly to Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory where they were filtered to combine multiple reports of the same formations into single tracks. Telephone operators would then forward only the information of interest to the group headquarters, where the map would be recreated. This process was repeated to produce another version of the map at the sector level, covering a much smaller area. Looking over their maps, group-level commanders could select squadrons to attack particular targets. From that point the sector operators would give commands to the fighters to arrange an interception, as well as return them to a base. Sector stations also controlled the anti-aircraft batteries in their area. An army officer sat beside each fighter controller and directed the gun crews when to open and cease fire. The Dowding system dramatically improved the speed and accuracy of the information that flowed to the pilots. During the early war period it was expected that an average interception mission might have a 30% chance of ever seeing their target. During the battle, the Dowding system maintained an average rate over 75%, with several examples of 100% rates. Every fighter dispatched found and intercepted its target. In contrast, Luftwaffe fighters attempting to intercept raids had to randomly seek their targets and often returned home having never seen enemy aircraft. The result is what is now known as an example of force multiplication. RAF fighters were as effective as 2 or more Luftwaffe fighters, greatly offsetting, or overturning, the disparity in actual numbers. Effect of signals intelligence. It is unclear how much the British intercepts of the Enigma cipher, used for high-security German radio communications, affected the battle. Ultra, the information obtained from Enigma intercepts, gave the highest echelons of the British command a view of German intentions. According to F. W. Winterbotham, who was the senior air staff representative in the Secret Intelligence Service, Ultra helped establish the strength and composition of the Luftwaffe's formations, the aims of the commanders, and provided early warning of some raids. In early August it was decided that a small unit would be set up at FCHQ, which would process the flow of information from Bletchley and provide Dowding only with the most essential Ultra material. Thus the Air Ministry did not have to send a continual flow of information to FCHQ, preserving secrecy, and Dowding was not inundated with non-essential information. Keith Park and his controllers were also told about Ultra. In a further attempt to camouflage the existence of Ultra, Dowding created a unit named No. 421 Flight RAF. This unit was equipped with Hurricanes and Spitfires and sent out aircraft to search for and report Luftwaffe formations approaching England. In addition, the radio listening service, monitoring the patterns of Luftwaffe radio traffic, contributed considerably to the early warning of raids. Air-sea rescue. One of the biggest oversights of the entire system was the lack of a proper air-sea rescue organization. The RAF had started organizing a system in 1940 with high-speed launches based on flying boat bases and at a number of overseas locations, but it was still believed that the amount of cross-channel traffic meant that there was no need for a rescue service to cover these areas. Downed pilots and aircrew, it was hoped, would be picked up by any boats or ships which happened to be passing by. Otherwise the local lifeboat would be alerted, assuming someone had seen the pilot going into the water. RAF aircrew were issued with a life jacket, nicknamed the Mae West, but in 1940 it still required manual inflation, which was almost impossible for someone who was injured or in shock. The waters of the English Channel and Dover Straits are cold, even in the middle of summer, and clothing issued to RAF aircrew did little to insulate them against these freezing conditions. The RAF also imitated the German practice of issuing fluorescein. A conference in 1939 had placed air-sea rescue under coastal command. Because a number of pilots had been lost at sea during the Channel battle, on August 22, control of RAF rescue launches was passed to the local naval authorities and 12 Lysaunders were given to Fighter Command to help look for pilots at sea. In all, some 200 pilots and aircrew were lost at sea during the battle. No proper air-sea rescue service was formed until 1941. Tactics. Fighter formations. In the late 1930s, Fighter Command expected to face only bombers over Britain, not single-engined fighters. A series of fighting area tactics were formulated and rigidly adhered to, involving a series of maneuvers designed to concentrate a squadron's firepower to bring down bombers. RAF fighters flew in tight, V-shaped sections of 3, with 4 such sections in tight formation. Only the squadron leader at the front was free to watch for the enemy. The other pilots had to concentrate on keeping station. Training also emphasized by the book attacks by sections breaking away in sequence. Fighter Command recognized the weaknesses of this structure early in the battle, but it was felt too risky to change tactics during the battle, because replacement pilots often with only minimal flying time could not be readily retrained, and inexperienced pilots needed firm leadership in the air only rigid formations could provide. German pilots dubbed the RAF formations Idiotenreihen because they left squadrons vulnerable to attack. Frontline RAF pilots were acutely aware of the inherent deficiencies of their own tactics. A compromise was adopted whereby squadron formations used much looser formations with 1 or 2 weavers flying independently above and behind to provide increased observation and rear protection. These tended to be the least experienced men and were often the first to be shot down without the other pilots even noticing that they were under attack. During the battle, 74 Squadron under Squadron leader Adolf Seyler-Malan adopted a variation of the German formation called the Fours in line astern, which was a vast improvement on the old 3-aircraft Vic. Malan's formation was later generally used by Fighter Command. Squadron and higher-level deployment. the weight of the battle fell upon 11 Group. Keith Park's tactics were to dispatch individual squadrons to intercept raids. The intention was to subject incoming bombers to continual attacks by relatively small numbers of fighters and try to break up the tight German formations. Once formations had fallen apart, stragglers could be picked off one by one. Where multiple squadrons reached a raid, the procedure was for the slower Hurricanes to tackle the bombers while the more agile Spitfires held up the fighter escort. This ideal was not always achieved, resulting in occasions when Spitfires and Hurricanes reversed roles. Park also issued instructions to his units to engage in frontal attacks against the bombers, which were more vulnerable to such attacks. Again, in the environment of fast-moving, three-dimensional air battles, fewer AF fighter units were able to attack the bombers from head-on. During the battle, some commanders, notably Lee Mallory, proposed squadrons be formed into big wings, consisting of at least 3 squadrons, to attack the enemy en masse, a method pioneered by Douglas Bader. Proponents of this tactic claimed interceptions in large numbers caused greater enemy losses while reducing their own casualties. Opponents pointed out the big wings would take too long to form up, and the strategy ran a greater risk of fighters being caught on the ground refueling. The big wing idea also caused pilots to overclaim their kills, due to the confusion of a more intense battle zone. This led to the belief big wings were far more effective than they were. The issue caused intense friction between Park and Lee Mallory, as 12 Group was tasked with protecting 11 Group's airfields whilst Park's squadrons intercepted incoming raids. However, the delay in forming up big wings meant the formations often did not arrive at all or until after German bombers had hit 11 Group's airfields. Dowding, to highlight the problem of the big wings' performance, submitted a report compiled by Park to the Air Ministry on November 15. In the report, he highlighted that during the period of September 11 to October 31, the extensive use of the big wing had resulted in just 10 interceptions and 1 German aircraft destroyed, but his report was ignored. Post-war analysis agrees Dowding and Park's approach was best for 11 Group. Dowding's removal from his post in November 1940 has been blamed on this struggle between Park and Lee Mallory's daylight strategy. However, the intensive raids and destruction wrought during the Blitz damaged both Dowding and Park in particular, for the failure to produce an effective night fighter defense system, something for which the influential Lee Mallory had long criticized them. Bomber and Coastal Command contributions. Bomber Command and Coastal Command aircraft flew offensive sorties against targets in Germany and France during the battle. After the initial disasters of the war, with Vickers-Wellington bombers shot down in large numbers attacking Wilhelmshaven and the slaughter of the Fanny-Ray battle squadron sent to France, it became clear the Bomber Command would have to operate mainly at night to achieve any results without incurring very high losses. From May 15, 1940, a nighttime bomber campaign was launched against the German oil industry, communications, and forests crops, mainly in the Ruhr area. As the threat mounted, Bomber Command changed targeting priority on June 3, 1940 to attack the German aircraft industry. On July 4, the Air Ministry gave Bomber Command orders to attack ports and shipping. By September, the buildup of invasion barges in the Channel ports had become a top priority target. On September 7, the government issued a warning that the invasion could be expected within the next few days and, that night, Bomber Command attacked the Channel ports and supply dumps. On September 13, they carried out another large raid on the Channel ports, sinking 80 large barges in the port of Ostend. 84 barges were sunk in Dunkirk after another raid on September 17 and by September 19, almost 200 barges had been sunk. The loss of these barges may have contributed to Hitler's decision to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The success of these raids was in part because the Germans had few free air radar stations set up in France, so that air defences of the French harbours were not nearly as good as the air defences over Germany. Bomber Command had directed some 60% of his strength against the Channel ports. The Bristol Blenheim units also raided German-occupied airfields throughout July to December 1940, both during daylight hours and at night. Although most of these raids were unproductive, there were some successes. On August 1, 5 out of 12 Blenheims sent to attack Hampstead and Evian were able to bomb, destroying or heavily damaging 3 Bf-109s of 2/JG-27 and apparently killing a Starfolker Peter Currency identified as a Hauptmann Albrecht von Ankenfrank. 2 other 109s were claimed by Blenheim gunners. Another successful raid on Hampstead was made by a single Blenheim on August 7 which destroyed one 109 of 4/JG-54, heavily damaged another and caused lighter damage to 4 more. There were some missions which produced an almost 100% casualty rate amongst the Blenheims. One such operation was mounted on August 13, 1940 against a Luftwaffe airfield near Aalborg in northeastern Denmark by 12 aircraft of 82 Squadron. 1 Blenheim returned early, the other 11, which reached Denmark, were shot down, 5 by flak and 6 by Bf-109s. Of the 33 crewmen who took part in the attack, 20 were killed and 13 captured. As well as the bombing operations, Blenheim-equipped units had been formed to carry out long-range strategic reconnaissance missions over Germany and German-occupied territories. In this role, the Blenheims again proved to be too slow and vulnerable against Luftwaffe fighters, and they took constant casualties. Coastal Command directed its attention towards the protection of British shipping, and the destruction of enemy shipping. As invasion became more likely, it participated in the strikes on French harbours and airfields, laying mines, and mounting numerous reconnaissance missions over the enemy-held coast. In all, some 9,180 sorties were flown by bombers from July to October 1940. Although this was much less than the 80,000 sorties flown by fighters, bomber crews suffered about half the total number of casualties borne by their fighter colleagues. The bomber contribution was, therefore, much more dangerous on a loss-per-sortie comparison. Bomber, reconnaissance, and anti-submarine patrol operations continued throughout these months with little respite and none of the publicity accorded to Fighter Command. In his famous August 20 speech about the few, praising Fighter Command, Churchill also made a point of mentioning Bomber Command's contribution, adding that bombers were even then striking back at Germany. This part of the speech is often overlooked, even today. The Battle of Britain Chapel in Westminster Abbey lists in a Roll of Honour, 718 Bomber Command crew members, and 280 from Coastal Command who were killed between July 10 and October 31. Phases of the battle. The battle can be roughly divided into 4 phases: July 10 August 11, Kanalkampf. 12 August 23, Adlerangriff, the early assault against the coastal airfields. August 24 September 6, the Luftwaffe targets the airfields. The critical phase of the battle. September 7 onwards, the day attacks switched to British towns and cities. Channel battles. The Kanalkampf comprised a series of running fights over convoys in the English Channel. It was launched partly because Kesselring and Spell were not sure about what else to do, and partly because it gave German aircrews some training and a chance to probe the British defences. Dowding could only provide minimal shipping protection, and these battles off the coast tended to favour the Germans, whose bomber escorts had the advantage of altitude and outnumbered the RAF fighters. From July 9 reconnaissance probing by Dornier Do-17 bombers put a severe strain on RAF pilots and machines, with high RAF losses to Bf-109s. When 9 141 Squadron Defiance went into action on July 19, 6 we lost to Bf-109s before a squadron of Hurricanes intervened. On July 25 the coal convoy and escorting destroyers suffered such heavy losses to attacks by Stuka dive bombers that the British Admiralty decided convoys should travel at night. The RAF shot down 16 raiders but lost 7 aircraft. By August 8 18 coal ships and 4 destroyers had been sunk, but the Navy was determined to send a convoy of 20 ships through rather than move the coal by railway. After repeated Stuka attacks that day, 6 ships were badly damaged, 4 were sunk and only 4 reached their destination. The RAF lost 19 fighters and shot down 31 German aircraft. The Navy now cancelled all further convoys through the Channel and sent the cargo by rail. However, these early combat encounters provided both sides with experience. Main assault. The main attack upon the RAF's defences was codenamed Adlerangriff. Poor weather delayed Adlertag until August 13, 1940. On August 12, the first attempt was made to blind the Dowding system, when aircraft from the Specialist Fighter Bomber Unit Erprobungsgruppe 210 attacked 4 radar stations. 3 were briefly taken off the air but were back working within 6 hours. The raids appeared to show that British radars were difficult to knock out. The failure to mount follow-up attacks allowed the RAF to get the stations back on the air, and the Luftwaffe neglected strikes on the supporting infrastructure, such as phone lines and power stations, which could have rendered the radars useless, even if the towers themselves remained intact. Adlertag opened with a series of attacks, led again by EPRO 210, on coastal airfields used as forward landing grounds for the RAF fighters, as well as satellite airfields. As the week drew on, the airfield attacks moved further inland, and repeated raids were made on the radar chain. August 15 was the greatest day, when the Luftwaffe mounted the largest number of sorties of the campaign. Luftflotte 5 attacked the north of England. Believing fighter command strength to be concentrated in the south, raiding forces from Denmark and Norway ran into unexpectedly strong resistance. Inadequately escorted by Bf-110s, bombers were shot down in large numbers. Northeast England was attacked by 65 Heinkel 111s escorted by 34 Messerschmitt 110s, and RAF Great Driffield was attacked by 50 unescorted Junkers 88s. Out of 115 bombers and 35 fighters sent, 16 bombers and 7 fighters were destroyed. As a result of these casualties, Luftflotte 5 did not appear in strength again in the campaign. August 18, which had the greatest number of casualties to both sides, has been dubbed the hardest day. Following the grinding battles of August 18, exhaustion and the weather reduced operations for most of a week, allowing the Luftwaffe to review their performance. The hardest day had sounded the end for the Ju-87 in the campaign. This veteran of Blitzkrieg was too vulnerable to fighters to operate over Britain, and to preserve the Stuka force, Gar Paragraph Ring withdrew them from the fighting. This removed the main Luftwaffe precision bombing weapon and shifted the burden of pinpoint attacks on the already stretched EPRO 210. The Bf-110 proved too clumsy for dogfighting with single-engine fighters, and its participation was scaled back. It would only be used when range required it or when sufficient single-engined escort could not be provided for the bombers. Gar Paragraph Ring made yet another fateful decision, to order more bomber escorts at the expense of free hunting sweeps. To achieve this, the weight of the attack now fell on Luftflotte 2, and the bulk of the Bf-109s and Luftflotte 3 were transferred to Kesselring's command, reinforcing the fighter bases in the Pas-de-Calais. Stripped of its fighters, Luftflotte 3 would concentrate on the night bombing campaign. Gar Paragraph Ring, expressing disappointment with the fighter performance thus far in the campaign, also made sweeping changes in the command structure of the fighter units, replacing many Geschwader Commodore with younger, more aggressive pilots like Adolf Galland and Werner Mar Paragraph LDERS. Finally, Gar Paragraph Ring stopped the attacks on the radar chain. These were seen as unsuccessful, and neither the Reichsmarschall nor his subordinates realized how vital the chain home stations were to the defense. It was known that radar provided some early warning of raids, but the belief among German fighter pilots was that anything bringing up the Tommies to fight was to be encouraged. The Luftwaffe targets RAF airfields, battle. Gar Paragraph Ring ordered attacks on aircraft factories on August 19, 1940. On August 23, 1940 he ordered that RAF airfields be attacked. That evening an attack was mounted on a tire factory in Birmingham. Raids on airfields continued through August 24, and Portsmouth was hit by a major attack. That night, several areas of London were bombed. The East End was set ablaze and bombs landed on central London. Some historians believe that these bombs were dropped accidentally by a group of Heinkel He-111s which had failed to find their target. This account has been contested. In retaliation, the RAF bombed Berlin on the night of August 26, and continued bombing raids on Berlin. Gar Paragraph Ring's pride was hurt, as he had previously claimed the British would never be able to bomb the city. The attacks enraged Hitler, who ordered retaliatory attacks on London. From August 24 onwards, the battle was a fight between Kesselring's Luftschlacht II and Park's 11 Group. The Luftwaffe concentrated all their strength on knocking out Fighter Command and made repeated attacks on the airfields. Of the 33 heavy attacks in the following 2 weeks, 24 were against airfields. The key sector stations were hit repeatedly, Biggin Hill and Herronchurch 4 times each. Debden and North Weald twice each. Croydon, Gravesend, Rochford, Hawking and Manston were also attacked in strength. Coastal Command's Eastchurch was bombed at least 7 times because it was believed to be a Fighter Command aerodrome. At times these raids caused some damage to the sector stations, threatening the integrity of the Dowding system. To offset some losses, some 58 Fleet Air Arm fighter pilot volunteers were seconded to RAF squadrons, and a similar number of former Fairey battle pilots were used. Most replacements from operational training units had as little as 9 hours flying time and no gunnery or air-to-air combat training. At this point, the multinational nature of Fighter Command came to the fore. Many squadrons and personnel from the air forces of the Dominions were already attached to the RAF, including top-level commanders Euro-Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, Rhodesians and South Africans. In addition, there were other nationalities represented, including Free French, Belgian and a Jewish pilot from the British Mandate of Palestine. They were bolstered by the arrival of fresh Czechoslovak and Polish squadrons. These had been held back by Dowding, who mistakenly thought non-English-speaking aircrew would have trouble working within his control system. However, Polish and Czech flyers proved to be especially effective. The pre-war Polish Air Force had lengthy and extensive training, and high standards. With Poland conquered and under brutal German occupation, the pilots of No. 303 Squadron, the highest-scoring Allied unit, were strongly motivated. Josef František, a Czech regular airman who had flown from the occupation of his own country to join the Polish and then French air forces before arriving in Britain, flew as a guest of 303 Squadron and was ultimately credited with the highest RAF score in the Battle of Britain. The RAF had the advantage of fighting over home territory. Pilots who bailed out of their downed aircraft could be back at their airfields within hours, while if low on fuel and/or ammunition they could be immediately rearmed. One RAF pilot interviewed in late 1940 had been shot down 5 times during the Battle of Britain, but was able to crash land in Britain or bail out each time. For Luftwaffe air crews, a bailout over England meant capture in the critical August period. Almost exactly as many Luftwaffe pilots were taken prisoner as were killed while parachuting into the English Channel often meant drowning or death from exposure. Morale began to suffer, and Knackrankheit a form of combat fatigue began to appear among the German pilots. Their replacement problem was even worse than the British. Impact of offensive: the effect of the German attacks on airfields is unclear. According to Stephen Bungay, Dowding, in a letter to Hugh Trincard accompanying Park's report on the period August 8 September 10, 1940, states that the Luftwaffe achieved very little in the last week of August and the first week of September. The only sector station to be shut down operationally was Biggin Hill, and it was non-operational for just 2 hours. Dowding admitted 11 Group's efficiency was impaired but, despite serious damage to some airfields, only 2 out of 13 heavily attacked airfields were down for more than a few hours. The German refocus on London was not critical. Retired Air Marshal Peter Dye, head of the RAF Museum, discussed the logistics of the battle in 2000 and 2010, dealing specifically with the single-seat fighters. Dye contends that not only was British aircraft production replacing aircraft, but replacement pilots were keeping pace with losses. The number of pilots in RAF Fighter Command increased during July, August and September. The figures indicate the number of pilots available never decreased. From July, 1,200 were available. In August 1, 1,400 were available. Just over that number were in the field by September. In October the figure was nearly 1,600. By November 1, 1,800 were available. Throughout the battle, the RAF had more fighter pilots available than the Luftwaffe. Although the RAF's reserves of single-seat fighters fell during July, the wastage was made up for by an efficient civilian repair organization, which by December had repaired and put back into service some 4,955 aircraft, and by aircraft held at air servicing unit airfields. Richard Overy agrees with Diane Bungay. Overy asserts only one airfield was temporarily put out of action and only 103 pilots were lost. British fighter production produced 496 new aircraft in July and 467 in August, and another 467 in September, covering the losses of August and September. Overy indicates the number of serviceable and total strength returns reveal an increase in fighters from August 3 to September 7, 1,061 on strength and 708 serviceable to 1,161 on strength and 746 serviceable. Moreover, Overy points out that the number of RAF fighter pilots grew by one-third between June and August 1940. Personnel records show a constant supply of around 1,400 pilots in the crucial weeks of the battle. In the second half of September it reached 1,500. The shortfall of pilots was never above 10%. The Germans never had more than between 1,100 and 1,200 pilots, a deficiency of up to one-third. If fighter command were the few, the German fighter pilots were fewer. Other scholars assert that this period was the most dangerous of all. In The Narrow Margin, published in 1961, historians Derek Wood and Derek Dempster believed that the 2 weeks from August 24 to September 6 represented a real danger. According to them, from August 24 to September 6 95 fighters had been totally destroyed and 171 badly damaged, against a total output of 269 new and repaired Spitfires and Hurricanes. They assert that 103 pilots were killed or missing and 128 were wounded, which represented a total wastage of 120 pilots per week out of a fighting strength of just fewer than 1,000. They conclude that during August no more than 260 fighter pilots were turned out by OTUs and casualties in the same month were just over 300. A full squadron establishment was 26 pilots whereas the average in August was 16. In their assessment, the RAF was losing the battle. Dennis Richards, in his 1953 contribution to the official British account history of the Second World War, agreed that lack of pilots, especially experienced ones, was the RAF's greatest problem. He states that between 8th and 18th August 154 RAF pilots were killed, severely wounded, or missing, while only 63 new pilots were trained. Availability of aircraft was also a serious issue. While its reserves during the Battle of Britain never declined to a half-dozen planes as some later claimed, Richards describes August 24 to September 6 as the critical period because during these 2 weeks Germany destroyed far more aircraft through its attacks on 11 Group Southeast bases than Britain was producing. 3 more weeks of such a pace would indeed have exhausted aircraft reserves. Germany had seen heavy losses of pilots and aircraft as well, however, thus its shift to nighttime attacks in September. On September 7 RAF aircraft losses fell below British production and remained so until the end of the war. By this point Hitler was becoming impatient with the Luftwaffe. On September 14, General Hans Jeschonnek, Luftwaffe Chief of Staff, persuaded Hitler for a last chance to defeat the RAF and sought permission to launch attacks on civilian residential areas to cause mass panic. Hitler refused the latter, perhaps unaware of just how much damage had already been done to civilian targets, as he wanted to reserve for himself the right to unleash the terror weapon. Political will was to be broken by the collapse of the material infrastructure, the weapons industry, along with the destruction of stocks of fuel and food. On September 16, Gar Paragraph Ring ordered the air fleets to begin the new phase of the battle. Within 2 months, American journalist Ralph Ingersoll published a book after a visit to Britain which stated that Adolf Hitler met his first defeat in 8 years which might go down in history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg by reducing the intensity of the Blitz after September 15. According to Ingersoll, A majority of responsible British officers who fought through this battle believed that if Hitler and Göring had had the courage and the resources to lose 200 planes a day for the next 5 days, nothing could have saved London. Instead, the Luftwaffe's morale in combat is definitely broken, and the RAF has been gaining in strength each week. Raids on British cities. Hitler's No. 17 directive, issued on August 1, 1940 on the conduct of war against England, specifically prohibited Luftwaffe from conducting terror raids on its own initiative, and reserved the right of ordering terror attacks as means of reprisal for the Far One Quarter himself. The war against England is to be restricted to destructive attacks against industry and air force targets which have weak defensive force. The most thorough study of the target concerned, that is vital points of the target, is a prerequisite for success. It is also stressed that every effort should be made to avoid unnecessary loss of life amongst the civilian population. The Luftwaffe offensive against Britain had included numerous raids on major ports since August, but Hitler had issued a directive London was not to be bombed save on his sole instruction. However, on the afternoon of August 15, Hauptmann Walter Rubinster paragraph RFFE leading a Probungsgruppe 210 mistakenly bombed the Croydon airfield instead of the intended target, RAF Kenley. This was followed on the night of 23/August 24 by the accidental bombing of Harrow, also on the outskirts of London, as well as raids on Aberdeen, Bristol, and South Wales. The focus on attacking airfields had also been accompanied by a sustained bombing campaign which began on August 24 with the largest raid so far, killing 100 in Portsmouth, and that evening the first night raid on London as described above. On August 25, 1940, 81 bombers of Bomber Command was sent out to raid industrial and commercial targets in Berlin. Clouds prevented accurate identification and the bombs fell across the city, causing some casualties amongst the civilian population as well as damage to residential areas. Continuing RAF raids on Berlin in retaliation led to Hitler withdrawing his directive, and on September 3 Gar Paragraph Ring planned to bomb London daily, with Kesselring's enthusiastic support. Having received reports the average strength of RAF squadrons was down to 5 or 7 fighters out of 12 and their airfields in the area were out of action. Hitler issued a directive on September 5 to attack cities including London. In his speech delivered on September 4, 1940, Hitler threatened to obliterate British cities if British bombing runs against Germany did not stop. On September 7, a massive series of raids involving nearly 400 bombers and more than 600 fighters targeted docks in the East End of London, day and night. The raids were codenamed Operation Loge. The RAF anticipated attacks on airfields and 11 Group rose to meet them, in greater numbers than the Luftwaffe expected. The first official deployment of 12 Group's Big Wing took 20 minutes to gain formation, missing its intended target, but encountering another formation of bombers while still climbing. They returned, apologetic about their limited success, and blamed the delay on being requested too late. Fighter command had been at its lowest ebb, short of men and machines, and the break from airfield attacks allowed them to recover. 11 Group had considerable success in breaking up daytime raids. 12 Group repeatedly disobeyed orders and failed to meet requests to protect 11 Group airfields, but their experiments with increasingly large big wings had some successes. The Luftwaffe began to abandon their morning raids, with attacks on London starting late in the afternoon for 57 consecutive nights of attacks. The most damaging aspect to the Luftwaffe of the change in targets was the increase in range. The Bf-109 escorts had a limited fuel capacity, and by the time they arrived had only 10 minutes of flying time before they had to turn for home. This left many raids undefended by fighter escorts. On September 14, Hitler chaired a meeting with the OKW staff. Gar Paragraph Ring was absent in France, as he had decided to direct the decisive part of the battle from there, and left Erhard Milch to deputize for him. At the meeting Hitler raised the question, should we call it off altogether? Hitler had accepted that an invasion with massive air cover was no longer possible. Instead he opted to try to crush British morale, while maintaining the threat of invasion. Hitler concluded this might result in 8 million going mad, which would cause a catastrophe for the British. In those circumstances, Hitler said, even a small invasion might go a long way. At this point, Hitler was against cancelling the invasion as the cancellation would reach the ears of the enemy and strengthen his resolve. On September 15, two massive waves of German attacks were decisively repulsed by the RAF, with every aircraft of 11 Group being used on that day. The total casualties on this critical day were 60 German and 26 RAF aircraft shot down. The German defeat caused Hitler to order, 2 days later, the postponement of preparations for the invasion of Britain. Henceforth, in the face of mounting losses in men, aircraft and the lack of adequate replacements, the Luftwaffe switched from daylight to nighttime bombing. The date of these air battles, September 15, became known as Battle of Britain Day. On September 27, a Junkers Ju-88 returning from a raid on London was shot down in Kent, resulting in the Battle of Graveney Marsh, the last action between British and foreign military forces on British mainland soil. On October 13, Hitler again postponed the invasion until the spring of 1941. However, the invasion never happened, and October is regarded as the month regular bombing of Britain ended. It was not until Hitler's Directive 21 was issued, on December 18, 1940, that the threat of invasion finally dissipated. During the battle, and for the rest of the war, an important factor in keeping public morale high was the continued presence in London of King George Virgin Islands US and his wife Queen Elizabeth. When war broke out in 1939, the King and Queen decided to stay in London and not flee to Canada, as had been suggested. George VI and Elizabeth officially stayed in Buckingham Palace throughout the war, although they often spent weekends at Windsor Castle to visit their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. Buckingham Palace was damaged by bombs which landed in the grounds on September 10 and, on September 13, more serious damage was caused by two bombs which destroyed the Royal Chapel. The royal couple were in a small sitting room about 80 yards from where the bombs exploded. On September 24, in recognition of the bravery of civilians, King George Virgin Islands US inaugurated the award of the George Cross. Attrition statistics. Overall, by November 2, the RAF fielded 1,796 pilots, an increase of over 40% from July 1940's count of 1,259 pilots. Based on German sources translated by the Air Historical Branch, Stephen Bungay asserts German fighter and bomber strength declined without recovery, and that from August to December 1940, the German fighter and bomber strength declined by 30 and 25%. In contrast, Williamson-Murray asserts that 1,380 German bombers were on strength on June 29, 1940, 1,420 bombers on September 28, 1,423 level bombers on November 2 and 1,393 bombers on November 30, 1940. In July-September the number of Luftwaffe pilots available fell by 136, but the number of operational pilots had shrunk by 171 by September. The training organization of the Luftwaffe was failing to replace losses. German fighter pilots, in contrast to popular perception, were not afforded training or rest rotations unlike their British counterparts. The first week of September accounted for 25% of the fighter command, and 24% of the Luftwaffe's overall losses. Between the dates August 26 to September 6, on only one day did the Germans destroy more aircraft than they lost. Losses were 325 German and 248 British. Luftwaffe losses for August numbered 774 aircraft to all causes, representing 18.5% of all combat aircraft at the beginning of the month. Fighter Command's losses in August were 426 fighters destroyed, amounting to 40% of 1,061 fighters available on August 3. In addition, 99 bombers and 27 other types were destroyed between 1 and 29 August. From July to September, the Luftwaffe's loss records indicate the loss of 1,636 aircraft, 1,184 to enemy action. This represented 47% of the initial strength of single-engine fighters, 66% of twin-engined fighters, and 45% of bombers. This indicates the Germans were running out of air crews as well as aircraft. Throughout the battle, the Germans greatly underestimated the size of the RAF and the scale of British aircraft production. Across the Channel, the Air Intelligence Division of the Air Ministry consistently overestimated the size of the German air enemy and the productive capacity of the German aviation industry. As the battle was fought, both sides exaggerated the losses inflicted on the other by an equally large margin. However, the intelligence picture formed before the battle encouraged the German Air Force to believe that such losses pushed fighter command to the very edge of defeat, while the exaggerated picture of German air strength persuaded the RAF that the threat it faced was larger and more dangerous than was the case. This led the British to the conclusion that another fortnight of attacks on airfields might force fighter command to withdraw their squadrons from the south of England. The German misconception, on the other hand, encouraged first complacency, then strategic misjudgment. The shift of targets from air bases to industry and communications was taken because it was assumed that fighter command was virtually eliminated. Between the 24th August and September 4, German serviceability rates, which were acceptable at Stuka units, were running at 75% with Bf-109s, 70% with bombers and 65% with Bf-110s, indicating a shortage of spare parts. All units were well below established strength. The attrition was beginning to affect the fighters in particular. By September 14, the Luftwaffe's Bf-109 Geschwader possessed only 67% of their operational crews against authorized aircraft. For Bf-110 units it was 46%. And for bombers it was 59%. A week later the figures had dropped to 64%, 52% and 52%. Serviceability rates in fighter command's fighter squadrons, between the 24th August and September 7, were listed as 64.8% on August 24, 64.7% on August 31 and 64.25% on September 7, 1940. Due to the failure of the Luftwaffe to establish air supremacy, a conference assembled on September 14 at Hitler's headquarters. Hitler concluded that air superiority had not yet been established and promised to review the situation on September 17 for possible landings on September 27 or October 8. 3 days later, when the evidence was clear that the German Air Force had greatly exaggerated the extent of their successes against the RAF, Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. Aftermath. The Battle of Britain marked the first defeat of Hitler's military forces, with their superiority seen as the key to victory. Pre-war theories led to exaggerated fears of strategic bombing, and British public opinion was invigorated by having come through the ordeal. For the RAF, Fighter Command had achieved a great victory in successfully carrying out Sir Thomas Inskip's 1937 air policy of preventing the Germans from knocking Britain out of the war. Churchill concluded his famous June 18 Battle of Britain speech in the House of Commons by referring to pilots and aircrew who fought the battle. If the British Empire and its Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The battle also signaled a significant shift in American opinion. During the battle, many Americans accepted the view promoted by Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador in London, who believed that Great Britain could not survive. However, Roosevelt wanted a second opinion, and sent Wild Bill Donovan on a brief visit to Britain. He became convinced Britain would survive and should be supported in every possible way. Both sides in the battle made exaggerated claims of numbers of enemy aircraft shot down. In general, claims were 2 to 3 times the actual numbers, because of the confusion of fighting in dynamic three-dimensional air battles. Post-war analysis of records has shown that between July and September, the RAF claimed 2,698 kills, while the Luftwaffe fighters claimed 3,198 RAF aircraft downed. Total losses, and start and end dates for recorded losses, vary for both sides. Luftwaffe losses from July 10 to October 30, 1940 total 1,652 aircraft, including 229 twin and 533 single-engined fighters. In the same period, RAF Fighter Command aircraft losses number 1087, including 53 twin-engined fighters. To the RAF figure should be added 376 Bomber Command and 148 Coastal Command aircraft conducting bombing, mining, and reconnaissance operations in defense of the country. The Luftwaffe had 1,380 bombers on June 29, 1940. By November 2, 1940, this had increased to 1,423, and to 1,511 by June 21, 1941, prior to Operation Barbarossa, but showing a drop of 200 from 1,711 reported on May 11, 1940. 1,107 single and 357 twin-engine daylight fighters were reported on strength prior to the battle on June 29, 1940, compared to 1,440 single and 188 twin-engined fighters, plus 263 night fighters, on June 21, 1941. There is a consensus among historians that the Luftwaffe simply could not crush the RAF. Stephen Bungay described Dowding and Park's strategy of choosing when to engage the enemy whilst maintaining a coherent force as vindicated. Their leadership, and the subsequent debates about strategy and tactics, however, had created enmity among RAF senior commanders, and both were sacked from their posts in the immediate aftermath of the battle. All things considered, the RAF proved to be a robust and capable organization which was to use all the modern resources available to it to the maximum advantage. Richard Evans wrote, "Irrespective of whether Hitler was really set on this course, he simply lacked the resources to establish the air superiority that was the sine qua non of a successful crossing of the English Channel." A third of the initial strength of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been lost in the Western Campaign in the spring. The Germans lacked the trained pilots, the effective fighter planes, and the heavy bombers that would have been needed. The Germans launched some spectacular attacks against important British industries, but they could not destroy the British industrial potential, and made little systematic effort to do so. Hindsight does not disguise the fact the threat to fighter command was very real, and for the participants it seemed as if there was a narrow margin between victory and defeat. Nevertheless, even if the German attacks on the 11 group airfields which guarded southeast England and the approaches to London had continued, the RAF could have withdrawn to the Midlands out of German fighter range and continued the battle from there. The victory was as much psychological as physical. Writes Alfred Price. The truth of the matter, borne out by the events of August 18, is more prosaic. Neither by attacking the airfields, nor by attacking London, was the Luftwaffe likely to destroy fighter command. Given the size of the British fighter force and the general high quality of its equipment, training and morale, the Luftwaffe could have achieved no more than a Pyrrhic victory. During the action on August 18 it had cost the Luftwaffe 5 trained aircrewmen killed, wounded or taken prisoner, for each British fighter pilot killed or wounded. The ratio was similar on other days in the battle. And this ratio of 5-to-1 was very close to that between the number of German aircrew involved in the battle and those in fighter command. In other words, the two sides were suffering almost the same losses in trained aircrew, in proportion to their overall strengths. In the Battle of Britain, for the first time during the Second World War, the German war machine had set itself a major task which it patently failed to achieve, and so demonstrated that it was not invincible. In stiffening the resolve of those determined to resist Hitler, the battle was an important turning point in the conflict. The British victory in the Battle of Britain was achieved at a heavy cost. Total British civilian losses from July to December 1940 were 23,002 dead and 32,138 wounded, with one of the largest single raids on December 19, 1940, in which almost 3,000 civilians died. With the culmination of the concentrated daylight raids, Britain was able to rebuild its military forces and establish itself as an Allied stronghold, later serving as a base from which the liberation of Western Europe was launched. Battle of Britain Day, Winston Churchill summed up the effect of the battle and the contribution of fighter command with the words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Pilots who fought in the battle have been known as the few ever since. At times being specially commemorated for on Battle of Britain Day, the 15th of September. On this day in 1940, the Luftwaffe embarked on their largest bombing attack yet, forcing the engagement of the entirety of the RAF in defence of London and the southeast, which resulted in a decisive victory in favour of Britain that proved to mark a turning point in Britain's favour. Within the Commonwealth, Battle of Britain Day has been observed more usually on the third Sunday in September, and even is the second Thursday of September in some areas in the British Channel Islands. Film. The story of the battle was documented in, amongst many others, the 1969 film Battle of Britain, which drew many respected British actors to act key figures of the battle, including Sir Laurence Olivier as Hugh Dowding and Trevor Howard as Keith Park. It also starred Michael Caine, Christopher Plummer and Robert Shaw as squadron leaders. Former participants of the battle served as technical advisors including Douglas Bader, James Lacey, Robert Stanford Tuck, Adolph Galland and Dowding himself. An Italian film around the same time titled Eagles Over London also featured the Battle of Britain. It was also the subject of the 1941 Allied propaganda film Churchill's Island, winner of the first ever Academy Award for documentary short subject. In 2010, actor Julian Glover played a 101-year-old Polish veteran RAF pilot in the short film, Battle for Britain. See also: Air Warfare of World War II, Battle Information, Battle of Britain RAF Squadrons, Battle of Britain RAF Airfields, List of RAF aircrew in the Battle of Britain, List of military aircraft operational during World War II, Operation Banquet, Operation Lucid. Battle in Contemporary History, The Darkest Hour, The Few, Coventry Blitz, Polish Air Forces in France and Great Britain, Evacuations of civilians in Britain during World War II. Post-war memorials, Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, Battle of Britain Memorial, Cable of Fern, Battle of Britain Monument in London, Kent Battle of Britain Museum, Battle of Britain Class Steam Locomotives of the Southern Railway, Polish War Memorial. References, footnotes. Citations. Bibliography, General. Autobiographies and Biographies. Aircraft. Additional references. External links, General, day-by-day blog charting the progress of the battle by ex-RAF veteran, Battle of Britain Historical Society, video, Battle of Britain on YouTube, complete film documentary by Frank Capra made for U.S. Army, The Battle of Britain in Photos, Royal Air Force History, Battle of Britain Memorial, BBC History Overview of Battle, Historical Recording BBC, Churchill's This Was Their Finest Hour speech, Radio New Zealand Sounds Historical ANZAC Day, April 25, 2008, historical recording of Sir Keith Park describing the Battle of Britain. Scroll down to 10:50 a.m. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding on the Battle of Britain, Royal Engineers Museum, Royal Engineers during the Second World War, Shoreham Aircraft Museum, Tangmere Military Aviation Museum, Kent Battle of Britain Museum, ADLG visits RAF Uxbridge Battle of Britain Operations Room, British Invasion Defences, the Falco and Regia Aeronautica in the Battle of Britain, History of Northfield Airfield, the Royal Mint Memorial website, New Zealanders in the Battle of Britain, New Zealanders in the Battle of Britain, Battle for Britain, short film starring Julian Glover, interactive map showing Battle of Britain airfields and squadrons by date.